Hi, and welcome to another edition of Handlaid Tracks and 3D Printed Trains with Socrates. Today we're taking a look at my first piece of curved track. I created a 10-inch curved radius jig so I can make 10-inch curved radius track, and this is the first time I actually printed one. It took a little while to get the design made because it's a little bit more complex than a straight track. And unfortunately, this first little bit of video is out of focus, but it's the same basic concept as building the straight track. Fill the jig up with small pre-cut to length ties with a copper tie on both sides and also with a pre-gap in the middle of it. And make sure, in this case also, that the rails are pre-rolled. I use a rail roller to curve the rails into the radius shape. And you take the flat rail and you curve it into the proper radius. In this case, it's a 10-inch radius. And once the rails are both curved to shape, you place them into the jig on top of the ties and start soldering. Now, this is the second version of my jig without the offset end, and I wanted to make the joints between two sections of track have an offset, so the connection between the two rails is in the middle of a copper tie and the other connection is one tie over. And so to do that, I first set this rail into the jig, soldered a couple ties on one side, and then moved one rail, one tie forward, and then went through and did the rest of the tie soldering. At this point, it becomes fairly straightforward, moving the clamps down, and I did about 4 ties in a row. I'm primarily just soldering the outsides to keep the insides nice and clean. I used that little 3-point Fast Tracks tie gauge. It has 2 on one side and 1 on the other that ride on top of the rails, and it maintains the track to a proper gauge, and it's also convenient to use as a pressure. So as I hit the solder onto it, I then put my finger on it and use it as a downwards pressure to make sure that the rails are nice and tight against the copper ties and everything's in alignment. Again, this is the second version of the jig. It was a little tight. I made the corners extra tight to make sure it would align, and that's been a little difficult getting the pieces out. Not impossible, but difficult. And in a couple spots, I think I melted it slightly as well, and that makes using a plastic jig much harder. And again, there's a couple minutes that's not perfect focus. The lamp apparently got in the way. But for the second section, I went through and made some more ties using my tie jig. Slip them in there and you can file them all to length at the same time, which is much easier than doing them by hand. And then once you have the beginnings of the second piece together, you can jig it together. I put the completed in the looser version of the jig and then the new in the same tight version. And then once everything is jigged together with new ties underneath it, just start the same process of soldering along a couple ties in a row, pressure with the track gauge, make sure the solder joint is nice and strong, move the jigs and continue the process until you get to the end. And this is pretty much the end of this piece of track. This was an 18-inch rail, and I did 2 18-inch rails the whole length, so this was pretty much a full-length piece of track. And the next step is to use the 3D printed track ties, because I didn't want to do manual creating a manual laying of individual wooden ties. So I went with a 3D printer and designed my own track bed, so it has a little gap for each of the copper ties, but also individual ties for the entire process. And so it's a nice, it works very well as well because it's fairly large. I have a 20 or 30 centimeter printer, and I do about 25 centimeter long pieces. And so this whole long piece of rail took 1.5 or so pieces of printed tie bed, put a little plyo bond on both sides, which is a contact adhesive. It dries on both sides. You allow both sides to dry. A half hour, hour later, 10 minutes or so, you push them together. You have a few moments to adjust it and put some weights on it for an hour, and it's pretty much a permanent thing after that. And just like that, it took less than an hour. I created 18 inches of curved track, nice 10-inch radius. I thought it came out very nice. I was quite happy with it. And when you put a rail car on it, it rolls very well. So that was the first time I made a 10-inch or curved piece of track. I have made some for 12 inches. I accidentally made one for a 6-inch because I didn't know the difference between radius and diameter when I was making that 12-inch curve, but nonetheless, I have a 6-inch for a trolley system or something perhaps. And I thought the jigs worked fairly well. Eventually, I'd like to cut them in aluminum, but frankly, they work pretty good printed. So at this point, it's a workable system, and I'm going to continue to build my time saver, and we'll get more and more trains running. So hope you enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, etc., and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.